Everyone, it's Antonio Galoni. Welcome to Vinous Learn. This is our first seminar. It's going to be really fun. We're going to talk today about Stag's Leap, and we've got some really cool wines to talk about and a map, and we're just going to go through the whole appellation, take all your questions. So the goal is to make this as interactive as possible, so please feel free to jump in, ask those questions. We are recording this, just so everyone's aware. And so you'll be able to watch it later, go back to the wines, go back to the Q&A, whatever is interesting for you. But this is going to be really fun. And thank you very much for being part of this. This is the first time we've done anything like this. And I'm a little nervous. I don't really know what to expect, but I think it's going to be really fun. And I hope you enjoy it. So today we're going to talk about Stag's Leap. And we've got 3 wines for each module. And everybody should have a core of it by now as well. If you have any issues, if you haven't gotten everything yet, or there's some sort of, if you haven't gotten the one thing we did send out in the note is that the Oakville map, which is our most popular best-selling map, is now being reprinted. So that one didn't ship in the box, but you'll get that very soon. In fact, you'll be the first people to see it because nobody's really seen it yet. But you should have the box of maps, 6 maps, 7th on the way, Corvin, 2 cases of wine. It's gonna be a lot of fun. And we're gonna do Stag's Leap today, and then we'll sort of move forward through the appellations. And the goal really is to really just, spend some time and really go in depth into each region, the wines, the producers. I'll answer whatever questions you have about vintages and how wines are made and so on and so forth. But I think hopefully, doing this on a Saturday, next week is on Sunday, by the way. Or no, it's 2 weeks from now is on Sunday, 4th of July weekend. But hopefully doing this on a Saturday, we've got time to just really relaxedly enjoy these wines, talk about them, and see what is on everyone's mind. So that's really how we're going to start. I'm going to show you where we are in Stag's Leap, and I thought Stag's Leap would be fun because it's really the appellation where in the more, obviously the history of Napa Valley for wine grapes, wine and other crops goes way back into the 19th century, but really it was the wines from Stag's Leap that, in the Judgment of Paris, that's when I think the world became known for when these wines sort of joined the global stage. And that's why I thought it'd be fun to start in Stag's Leap. And so that's what we're doing. And I'm going to show you sort of where we are and what the lay of the land is. But we're going to start by just sort of getting a little oriented. So hopefully everybody can see this map. It's not our map, unfortunately. We haven't done one of these yet, so apologies for that. But this is the big map that someday will be, I don't know, a mural somewhere. But this is all of Napa Valley. This is a pretty cool map. I'll zoom it out a little bit so you can sort of see where we are. This is the wineries of the Napa Valley map. So thank you to them. So you can see the city of Napa down here. And this is going to be basically a tour through the various appellations. So right now, we're going to focus on Stag's Leap, which I'll show you is right here. So as you would have seen, town of Napa, you would usually drive up from San Francisco or Napa through 29, which is here, the Silverado Trail, which is here. And I think one of the first things that you'll notice from this map is, I think oftentimes there's a perception that you're going north, but what you're really doing is going northwest. And that's more important. As you can see, the slope of that line actually gets more and more dramatic as you move northwest. The angle increases, and by the time you get up here to the northern valley, St. Helena and Calistoga, you are really going almost west. And so this is one of the interesting things about maps and just sort of the perception is that the map will show you what's actually real, whereas the perception is not always so real. So when we're driving on 29 or the trail, it's easy to think that we're going north, but we're not. We're going slightly northwest. And the more north you go, the more northwest you go, actually. So that's, I think, important to keep in mind as we go through this tour. So here we are, Stag's Leap, this area in gray. I'm going to show you. So we're in the southern part of Napa Valley relative to, say, St. Helena and Calistoga. And that's important. I know this map isn't maybe the super highest definition, but the idea is just to just to put it into place where we are, and then I'll show you our map, which is super crisp and it's focused just on this area. But one of the key takeaways is the southern part of Napa Valley is cooler than the north generally. And I'll show you why that is that way as it pertains to Stag's Leap. But just in general, you're closer to San Francisco and the Bay. You've got more of a marine influence, more of a cooling influence, especially at night. And as you get north, St. Helena, Calistoga, those areas are generally warmer. There's pockets of cooler, there's pockets of coolness in those appellations. But if you want to just sort of have a rule of thumb and sort of start to put into your mind a little bit, how do these AVAs fit together? What's the rationale? What are some of the sort of key takeaways? One of them would be that the southern part of Napa Valley is cooler than the northern part. So here you have Oak Knoll, here you have Stag's Leap. Then we're going to talk about Yountville. You can see how these AVAs fit in. So Stag's Leap has a natural border here with the Napa River, and then this white part here is the Palisades. I'll show you that on our map. It's much clearer. Then you move up through Oakville, Rutherford. Okay, this area here, which is in white and not an AVA, this is Pritchard Hill. We'll get to that later. We have a map, obviously, for Pritchard Hill, but is not technically considered an AVA. But that's this area here. Okay. So now Rutherford, and then we move into St. Helena, which is a big area. As I'm looking at this map, I'm not sure really why they've sort of done it this way, but this is St. Helena here, and this is in our map what we call Con Valley, which is an area here. We see Rick Foreman. This is just on the border of the St. Helena AVA area, and then this area here is Con Valley. You can see CV, and we'll talk about that when we get to St. Helena map, which is a pretty cool map. The designer, our team hated me because I decided at the last minute that we were going to include say the Con Valley. It's a pretty complex map. And then this is Calistoga up here, which we have not mapped yet. So that is the general sort of lay of the land. And now I'd like to show you, we'll just zoom in a little bit more specifically on where we are. And I'm going to show you the Stag's Leap map, which is one of 7 maps that we've done of Napa Valley, and we've done others of, we've got a map of the Santa Lucia Highlands. We've got a 5-map set of Sonoma Valley. These are sort of in this, they've just been, their publication has been delayed just because of COVID, but they're done. And they're almost, basically going to be published imminently. But this is the map of Stag's Leap. This is basically every vineyard. And what the goal when we did these maps is we really wanted to have we wanted to have Burgundy level maps for Napa Valley. I had the chance to see those maps when I was just learning about wine. They really inspired me. And I thought, when I started writing about Napa Valley wines, I was working for Robert Parker, and I would be driving in these areas and reviewing these wines. I didn't always know whose vineyard was whose, and I felt kind of embarrassed about it, to be honest. So I thought, well, we should really have Napa Valley maps. We should really have high quality Napa Valley maps. So I started to put together this team in 2015 with my colleague Alessandro Masnaghetti, whose name is down here. And he's the guy who's done those amazing Barolo and Barbaresco books, if you have those. And so he helped us. This is his map here. And then Kelly White, who a lot of people know, who's really big and very highly respected author of, especially with a great deal of knowledge of Napa Valley. She helped sort of gather all the data and put this, sort of help do all a lot of the grunt work on putting this map together. So that was our team in 2016 when we did the first edition of this map. And so this is what Stag's Leap looks like. So now I'll show you what it would look like. So you would arrive here if you're coming from the south. This is a Silverado Trail. You'll recognize a lot of these wineries here. So you can already see that we're moving we're already moving at an angle. And there's there's 2 natural boundaries. These are the Palisades here. So up to about 1,200 feet in altitude, very rugged land. and the AVA border is here where the dotted line is. So that's one border there. The Napa Valley River is here, and this would be Yountville over here. And you know, the Napa River was once a very, now it looks like a real river when there's a flood, but back in the day it was a real active river that made crossing between here impossible, and or possible only in limited times of the year. And so that's one of the reasons why it's a real barrier. I mean, at least when this land was sort of started to be created like this. So this is Napa River here. And then the other really interesting aspect of Napa Valley, I mean of Stag's Leap, is this other little, which you don't see anywhere else, is this area here, which is often called the valley within the valley. And it is you can see that there's hills here, here, here. So between those hills and these hills here, there's this little tiny valley, and it creates, again, it sort of channels that air. And so that's another really unique feature to Stag's Leap. You don't see that in any other part of the valley. And in fact, the valley does open as we get more north. You'll see, I'll show you as we go along. But those are sort of the three main aspects of Napa of Stag's Leap. So just to highlight some of the main vineyards here, just to sort of take you through a tour, and then we'll taste some wines and look at some questions. But so here, so this will be the south. So this is the Schaefer Borderline Vineyard. So this is the vineyard that is a big part of the 1.5 Cabernet that's in the tasting today. So this is the southern part here. Neverbend is a vineyard that is most of this fruit, maybe all of it, goes to Mondavi, even though they don't own it anymore. So another unique aspect of Stag's Leap is that Robert Mondavi Winery is the biggest landowner here, which you'll see when we look at the map. But a lot of times they're obviously much more associated with Oakville and To Kalon, but they have quite a bit of land here, and we'll talk about that in a second. Chimney Rock, another historic estate here, different parcels. So we'll taste one of their wines today, and then they make a lot of different single block wines, which are really fun to taste because you really start to see the difference in that one vineyard. And even here from the south, which is cooler, to the north here, which is warmer, in this tiny little span here, you have quite a bit of difference. And it's, again, you know, one of the things about how many differences there are in relatively small pieces of land within small ranches. You know, we usually tend to think of, that's a very sort of Burgundian way to think about the world, where every little vineyard is different, and it's true, but it's true also in Napa Valley. So this is Chimney Rock. And then Clos du Val Hirondelle, this is the original Clos du Val ranch, the ranch that the family bought, the Goulet family bought first, early 70s here. So it's sort of ensconced within Chimney Rock. So that's this ranch here. And then they also lease this much larger piece from the Ragucci family, who then own this other part of the sort of same ranch, but more into the mountains, and they make wine as well. So those two pieces of land are very important. Futo is here. You know, he's mostly known for his Oakville wines, but if you've had the Futo wine called 5500, that's the name of that's the address. That's here. And the fruit from this ranch goes into both the Futo wine called 5500, and then the OVSL, which is sort of I mean, he'll kill me if I say this, but it's not really like their second wine, but it's sort of the not so crazy wine in that range. So they've got the Oakville wine, they have the 5500, and then just below that, there's this wine that they called OVSL, and the SL is Stag's Leap. So that's a part of this fruit goes in there. So there's Clos du Val, Ragucci as we get north, other main places. So these are the two Stag's Leap wine cellars, vineyards, which are obviously very famous here. Then Realm is here. They make the wine that they call the wine that they make from here now they call Moonracer, and they bought that land from the Hartwells, and the Hartwells kept this little piece of land here. Pine Ridge makes wines always under appellation level, but they've got a nice piece of land here and some others. Odette is in an interesting story. So this is part of the Plumpjack group here, and this was once part of a larger ranch. You can see here that this whole area, I'm going to show you the back of the map in a second because that's history. and you can read that, sort of at your own time. But it's really the history of these different ranches. But you can sort of see that this was almost certainly one piece of land before. And Dick Stelzner here, he is one of the most famous people in Stag's Leap because he farmed, I think at one time as many as 400 acres for different people. He sold Clos d'Aval, the fruit that they used for their wine in the Judgment of Paris. So the first Clos d'Aval wine was not an estate wine; it was a Stelzner wine from here. And so here up against the mountains is considered a very prime piece of land. And so he sells, they make wines themselves under the Stelzner brand. And then they also sell wine to people like Mike Smith for Myriad and others who are now making Stelzner Vineyard Designate. So that's here. And I think it was in 2012, the Stelzners sold this piece of land, Odette, which is part of the Plumpjack group. So we have an Odette wine in one of our other tastings, but that's this ranch here. It used to be part of this. The other notable ranches here, Malk family is a little property. The wines are really starting to get good. And if you said to me what's kind of an emerging property or somebody we haven't heard of yet or something that might be really interesting in the future, I'd be looking at this small vineyard here. Let's see, other really interesting areas. So here we have Joseph Phelps Las Rocas. So one of the things that people may not know is that Insignia is largely made up of fruit from Stag's Leap. And so you have Las Rocas here, and then they have another piece of land here, Barbosa. So those are big core holdings for Insignia. And so even though they're not vineyard designated as such, I think we'll talk in a second about what the signatures are of Stag's Leap wines, but Phelps is a really big player here. Lindstrom is a tiny little estate with lots of little blocks. You can see how little the vineyards are. This vineyard is by Mike Wolf, who's one of the most respected vineyard managers in Napa Valley. The wines are made by Celia Welch. It's a really distinctive hillside wine here. Wildfoot. So this vineyard is owned by Jean Phillips, and she's the woman who once owned Screaming Eagle. And this vineyard here is really cool. And Russell Bevan gets all or most of this fruit for wine that he makes with as a vineyard designated. And I think that that's just a knockout wine. To me, classic Stag's Leap sort of character. Let's see what else is of note. So Quixote, so Stag's Leap Winery. So this is the Stag's Leap that's part of Treasury Wine Estates. So that's also all historically tied together. Quixote and Comono, that was once a property owned by Carl Domaney, who's one of the really historic people in Napa Valley. And then here you have Schaefer. This is where, so Schaefer is a really interesting property. I mean, obviously people know Hillside Select, but it's an example of sort of things that happen accidentally. We can talk about the history here, but basically John Schaefer moved his family out here from Chicago in the early 70s. This vineyard was planted with the sort of grapes that were common at the time, so all sorts of things, including Cabernet. But, Cabernet was not the main grape in Napa Valley up until just relatively recently. And so in this ranch, the most important wine is the Hillside Select, which comes from certain parcels. But one of the things that's really interesting about Schaefer is that there's really cool clonal material here, including things from Islay, for example, Bella Oaks, which is in Rutherford. We'll talk about that in another class. But in the 90s, when Napa Valley was being redeveloped, again, one of the rootstocks that UC Davis said you have to plant is AXR1. And nobody knew at the time that AXR1 was going to be susceptible to phylloxera, and this is why a lot of the valley had to be replanted almost immediately afterwards. The Schaefers had relationships with these old sort of Italian immigrant families, and they said, no, St. George, which is the traditional rootstock of Napa Valley. And so there's actually Islay clone Cabernet on St. George rootstock at Schaefer and some of these really selected plots, as well as other things too. And so this is obviously a really interesting ranch here. So that's Schaefer. And then Schweitzer, this is one of the core blocks for the Robert Mondavi wine that we have in this tasting. And I'll talk about the wine when we get to the wines, but this is I think a really interesting ranch. I mean, you can see obviously its position with its neighbor, but I think really interesting piece of land here. And then let's see what else is of note. So now we're into the northern part of of Stag's Leap. So you see these other Pine Ridge parcels, and again, they blend those all into into a single wine. I mentioned Phelps here. Sinsky has SLD Estate, Baldacci. So those are always, really rich, voluptuous wines. And then, of course, Cliff Lady. So Cliff Lady is got a bunch of land here. So this is Yountville Crossroad here. So the winery's here. So if you've ever driven by here, this is like where all the tour buses are, like on the weekends. So that's one of their main ranches. And then the poetry blocks here up into the hillside, that's where they make a lot of their top wines. This is where the inn is. And these are really beautiful, rugged mountain kind of vineyards and just really evocative. So that's kind of a lay of the land of this. And then I'm going to show you the back of the map. And then I'd love to get some questions, so I don't talk all the time. But I want to show you this. Let's see if I'm capable of doing this. I want to show you the back of the map because to me, the front of the map is interesting, but I always think you need more. And so what we wanted to do with these maps is also capture history. And to do that, what I wrote on the back is what I call the narrative. So these are narrative maps. So hopefully you can see that now. And so this is what you have, in your kits. But this is the history of the appellation here. And then I'm not going to bore you like sort of reading this to you, but you can read through this at your own leisure. But you can sort of see how we've divided Stag's Leap. I talked about the valley within the valley that's here. Lower Stag's Leap is here. We really wanted to have cutting edge imagery. And also to explain what you're seeing. I think that there's a lot of great maps, I think, in wine, but a lot of times they're flat and they don't tell you anything. And so the back of the map is what we call the narrative map. And I hope you like it. I spent a lot of time researching this, talking to people, interviewing people, and trying to condense it all into something that's, sort of easy to understand and deal with. But and I hope you like the artistry of Alessandro's 3D maps, which I think really bring the features of the land to life. So you can go through this as when you have time. But that's these, and so that's what these are. The sort of the narrative maps. The back is sort of the history. Does anybody have any questions or anything that you want to talk about before we dive into some wines? Everybody's really quiet. I promise that nobody bites. This is a very friendly group of people. Okay, well, then that's sort of the overview of the region. Why don't we dive into some wines, and hopefully, maybe in some of the future sessions, people will ask more things. But we've got two different vintages here, and I think it's a great opportunity to sort of take a look at the recent vintages that are available. So there's two of them are 2017s. So 17 is a really interesting vintage. I think a lot of people forget the beginning of the year. The beginning of the year was unbelievably rainy and wet, to the point of creating all sorts of disasters, sort of. If you go by Pope Street in St. Helena, well, I haven't been there in a while because of this pandemic. It may be open now, but it's been closed for a long time. There were landslides. I remember being in Sonoma, being evacuated from a tasting room, which has never happened before. So it was quite wet in the beginning of the year, and so one of the things that did is it created a lot of foliage, a lot of green. Sort of in the spring, and all of that stuff dried in the summer, which was very, very warm. And so then for the production of wine, the main event really was around Labor Day. It was unbelievably hot, without any sort of cooling off in the evening, and just warm. We'll talk about the fires in a second, but because that's sort of what people remember, but for the purposes of making wine, the real big challenge was the severe drought and severe high temperatures in 17, right around Labor Day. And so that's still early for sort of Cabernet harvest time, which is usually more like in October. And so what happened in 2017 is you started to have this very interesting phenomenon, which is very, very rare, which is a lot of times when people think about a warm vintage, you think, oh, the wines are going to be really rich and fat and voluptuous and intense, and they can be. They very much can be. But if it gets too hot, if it gets extremely hot, then what happens is the vine starts to what kicks in is really this instinct of survival. And what the vine does is to live, it just shuts down ripening. It says, I have to conserve my energy to live, literally. And so that's it, nothing else. So what happens is the vines literally shut down. When people talk about hydric stress, this is what they're talking about. This tends to be the sort of vineyards that get hurt the most by this are younger vineyards, because what you want is, there's a big discussion about dry farming in California, really all over the world, but obviously, as you know, in California, you can irrigate. There's always a discussion of irrigation and is it good or is it not good? Well, so an irrigation is, of course, giving the vines water, either through usually through some sort of tubing that's in the vineyard. What happens is that if you dry farm, which means no water, what you're hoping for is you get the vines to go into the ground very, very deep and that they get their own nutrients on their own. That is almost impossible to do in Napa Valley and all but a few places. And so most vineyards are irrigated. And so when that happens, obviously then the vine doesn't have to work quite so much. And so the places where severe heat is going to be very damaging are younger vineyards where the root systems haven't gone low for maybe another reason, which is they just haven't had time. But younger vineyards get very hurt. Now, obviously, very well exposed vineyards get hurt. And then we'll talk about 2015 in a second, but one of the things that has really changed in Napa Valley, if you've been visiting for a number of years, is you see much more shade cloth than you used to. And shade cloth is kind of a product of 2015. But in the 17 vintage, what happened is when you get that heat in Labor Day, it is so severe that the vines shut down. And then something really strange happened, which very few people have any experience with, which is you started to get a reversal of ripening, which is very strange and hard to explain. But basically, the ripening of the sugars in vines is expressed as Brix, and you're trying to you're looking for a certain level of ripeness of the sugar. And in 2017, after the worst of the heat, you started to see the Brix retreat, start to go back, which is something very few people have any experience with because it's really rare. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard of that happening anywhere except for Napa Valley in 2017. So it's not like people have a lot of experience of sort of dealing with this situation. So now the Brix start to retreat. And then you have a choice, which is, do you want to wait it out, or do you feel like your fruit has been compromised by the heat and you sort of rush to pick? So in 17, you started to get all sorts of different decisions. You got some people who said, no, we're going to wait a few more weeks and let the fruit sort of come back, because that's what you hope happens after a severe heat event, that it is really a shock, but then you can recover. Or you say, you know what, we're sort of like on the downward slope here. We need to kind of get this done. And so you saw all sorts of different types of reactions. Now, obviously, bigger estates that have a lot of land, they can't wait on everything. So, this is where small properties are generally advantaged in tough years, because you've got a smaller piece of land and you can be nimble. You can say, I'll wait a week, I'll wait a day, I'll wait 3 days. When you're a big winery, you have to harvest. You have all this land, it's got to get picked, so you don't have the luxury of waiting forever. So that's 2017. And this is why when you taste the 2017 Cabernets, a lot of them are a little bit light. They're lower in alcohol than you would expect. They're not necessarily super concentrated. So this is really the paradox of 2017, is that even though it's a year with severe heat, at a critical juncture, Labor Day weekend, the wines don't taste like you would expect them to taste in that style of a year. So that's like sort of the first takeaway. And then, of course, in October, you got the fires, and that was obviously devastating. In some places more than others. I think that a lot of the challenges from that year are not necessarily expressed as smoke taint. So there's a lot of opinions about how much smoke compromises fruit and a wine. Is it a little bit? Is it a lot? Can you wait it out? I mean, there's all sorts of different opinions. And in Napa Valley, there's other parts of the world where maybe, like, say, Australia, for example, there may be more research available, more experience in dealing with vintages like this. But in Napa Valley, this was just sort of unprecedented. So you had fruit that hadn't been picked yet. And so most people would say that fruit's been compromised. In fact, when I went in every year in the fall, in the spring, I go and I taste the new vintage, and somebody said, you want to, somebody's like, I suppose you're trying to figure out how like, ruined this vintage is. And I'm like, being polite. No, not exactly. He goes, well, if you want to taste smoke tainted wines, I've got some. So I got a really good education on what that really is. And it's not just a flavor, it's a textural thing, which we don't need to get into because none of that applies to these wines. But the last point I want to make on 17 is that the real big issue with the wines is not necessarily smoke taint, but all of the challenges that you have in not being able to access a winery. And there were quite a few wines that were actually lost, not because the fruit was compromised necessarily, but because wineries lost power for a week, didn't have, you couldn't get there, smoke got in, things that aren't necessarily directly, I mean, they're related to the fire, but they're not about smoke taint. They're about the results of that fire, which closed roads down for a week or more in some places. You hear stories about people sneaking in or people sleeping at their winery. And so a lot of the challenges of that vintage are really sort of in the production side. And then 15, which we'll taste the Mondavi wine, is an interesting vintage because that had very strong heat event also, and a really variable fruit. I mean, when it was harvested, I mean, these clusters, there was a lot of sunburn, a lot of small berries. You can get rid of that in sorting, but when we taste this wine, you'll see there's a really intense ripe profile. And this was when people started to use shade cloth after 15 because the sort of heat was really intense, longer than expected, more severe than expected. And so that really marks the wines. So I think we should taste. What do you think? We'll start with Chimney Rock. So that's this wine, I'm going to hold it up. There's a lot of times people say I don't hold these wines up there long enough. So this is the Chimney Rock Stag's Leap wine. I'm going to show you, I think I'll put this map up again so people can see where we are. And we'll talk about that. But that wine is basically taken from across the property, and it is a blend of the property. So let's see if I can do this. See how good my technology is. We're going to do this. And I want to show you where we are. All right, so hopefully you can see that. And we are going to be here at the bottom. See if I can blow this up a little bit more, bring it over. Okay, so there's Chimney Rock. This is convenient because both of the wines are from this area, so we don't have to deal with my technical ineptitude here. So Chimney Rock. So various different parcels, lots of different wines, lots of clonal diversity, and this is the appellation wine from the ranch. And so let's taste it. So I think hopefully everybody got a Corvin, but I'm opening this wine because it's been a really long week and it's Saturday. So let's check it out. This the 17. So 17, Stag's Leap, Chimney Rock, Cabernet. So I forgot to mention, what are the signatures of Stag's Leap Cabernets? So the first to me is that the wines always have this very intense floral quality in the aromatics that is kind of it's sort of a floral, but also a sweetness, as in like a liqueur, like a creme de cassis, which is what you put into a kir, or like a hard candy, those candies that maybe you might remember have the sort of like the hard outside and the sweet inside. So there's always this really there's this floral quality, and to me the aromatic component of Stag's Leap Cabernets is one of the biggest signatures. And when I'm lucky that I have a chance to taste the wines from all these different places, and that is one of the things that you see in these wines sort of across the board is the aromatics. And when you taste this wine, if somebody poured, like for me, if somebody poured this wine blind, there's no way I would say it's a wine from a warm vintage. It's fresh, it's medium in body, it's not an ooze monster kind of wine. The fruit is more of a red fruit quality, and that's, I think, typical of this year. The wines have that quality. In cooler years, you get more of that sort of bluish, purplish kind of blackberry kind of fruit, and we'll have some of those wines in this course, in other seminars. But here today, the 17 has really bright red fruit and a lot of raspberry kind of flavors and pomegranate. And then the other, I think, interesting quality in this wine is a sort of blood orange sort of thing, which is kind of, it's citrus, but red, as opposed to citrus and like lemon or lime. It's a red citrus kind of quality, which is the freshness. And so I think this is a perfect example of the elegance of 2017. And I think most winemakers are pretty afraid of selling this vintage. I think some of these wines are not even released yet. Some are, but there's so much trepidation over the year. And I think when you taste this wine, you can see there's no angularity, there's no hardness, there's no awkwardness. And that's why I picked it, because for this seminar, because it really, to me, expresses the vintage, the place, and the style of the estate. So that's the Chimney Rock wine. Let's do this. So that's this. Then we're going to move to Schaefer. So again, the Schaefer wine is from this ranch, Borderline Ranch. And I picked this wine because I think that, let's be honest, a lot of times the prices of wines are really very high and they're prohibitively expensive. And, when I was sort of starting out, one of the things that people always said was, buy the less expensive wines from the very best estates, right? So there's lots of different ways you can do that. And it depends on the region, obviously. But we just published a ton of Bordeaux reviews the last week. So like the second wine of a really top estate, like those are really good wines. And I wouldn't call 1.5 a second wine, but it's obviously not the flagship Hillside Select. And one of the things I love about this wine is that it's still relatively affordable. Obviously Napa Valley has a sort of a scale of prices that's maybe different from other parts of the world, but one of the things I love about this wine is that I think it's very Schaefer and it drinks well young. And it's about I've had them older, and it's the wine you want to drink and I think it sort of reaches its peak around ages 12 to 15, so it's not really a wine for cellaring. But I like this wine a lot because I think it delivers a lot of value, a lot of Schaefer character, and it's obviously Stag's Leap. So that's 1.5 here. And this wine is from here, this parcel here. It's got some fruit from the big ranch over here, up here, but it's mostly down there. So I think it's really fantastic to taste these two wines that are, because you remember from the first map, Stag's Leap is a pretty small appellation relative to others. And one of the things I think is interesting about tasting these two wines side by side is they're very similar in some ways and also really different. And I hope that nobody minds sort of geeking out, but in these seminars. But if you'll allow me to do that just for a few minutes, I think that the real beauty is sort of the details, right? How you could have two wines that are really, as I said, they're really similar and they're really different. So the way that they're really similar is, I think the initial expression of that floral quality is very similar between the two wines. The Schaefer's a little bit darker, but you still get that floral note, that sort of rose petal, spice, kind of cinnamon lift. Both of those wines have that. It's just so clear. Then in tasting, the Schaefer has more palate weight, more depth, and it's a darker wine. And there's, I'm sure, many reasons for that. But I think the takeaway is that a lot of times, I think when people taste wines, people spend a lot of time thinking um, about taste. You know, is it raspberry? Is it rose petal? Is it blackberry? And that's fine. You know, obviously there's no problem with that. But we know that that's really a response to your olfactory sense, really, because you don't taste those things, but they're suggestions. And everybody's personal experience with wine and with life is very different. So what I think of as a blackberry, somebody else might think of as a raspberry or whatever. And the thing about aromas and flavors in wine is that they evolve over time. These wines are very young. So in a few years, you'll start to get more cedar, tobacco, dried flowers, licorice, you know, the sort of what people start to call tertiary aromas, the aromas and flavors of a wine that starts to get mature. Right now, both wines are very, very much on their fruit. But what the Schaefer has that's very different from the Chimney Rock is it's got that depth, that sort of richness, you know, and that's a texture thing. And it's also a question of preference. If you find yourself attracted to one wine more than the other, let's say, that's just a question of personal preference. You know, for me, wine is never a competition. It's never a question of this one is better than that. It's just when I review wines, it's more a question of like how much of its potential has a certain wine achieved. So it's really never about competition or a wine being better. But there's no question, at least to me, that the Schaefer wine has a much greater sense of mid-palate richness and depth. And so what's interesting, I think, about that is that those are qualities that will remain in wines over time. You know, the flavors, the aromas in wines, they change, but the textures of wines, they stay the same. And so that's one of the reasons why often when I'm writing about wine, I often think about talking about the textures, because if I say that the wine has red fruit, maybe half of the people watching this that might agree, and maybe the other half say, well, what's he talking about? I don't get that at all. But if I say one wine is more airy and more ethereal, more perfumey, and another wine is more powerful, more rich, more dense, then that, may be something that hopefully 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 people might say, oh yeah, okay, I get it. I mean, that's not the same thing as saying agreeing or necessarily seeing it exactly the same way, but I think it may be more relevant, more easy for people to sort of latch onto that because it's less subjective. It's more about, okay, one wine is definitely lighter, one wine is definitely more powerful. And you know what? Those wines will be like that forever. I mean, wines can change a little bit texturally, but their intrinsic qualities, their DNA stays the same. So when I taste the Schaefer wine, I mean, I think there's a little bit more oak. There's more of those sort of torrefaction notes, So torrefaction is like, the fancy wine. I always promise myself not to use like these fancy words, but, it just basically means, like the roast, like in a coffee shop, that flavor of like beans being roasted, which is a compound of the barrel basically. But that, I think when you taste the Schaefer, you get more of those chocolatey notes, more of those spice notes, more, sort of leather. And it's just a little bit more of a virile kind of wine. But at the same time, I think it's got the same aromatic profile, not the same exactly, but similar to the Chimney Rock. So I think that that's a really interesting takeaway because that's, what is such a signature of the appellation. So that is Schaefer 1.5. And then I chose this wine from Robert Mondavi Winery, Stag's Leap District. So when I go there every year, I taste all their wines, obviously, and there's the Fumé Blancs and there's the Carneros, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and then all of the Oakville Cabernets and the To Kalon wines and so on and so forth. And one of the wines that I always love is this Stag's Leap wine, which is always kind of like sort of like off to the side and never really featured. And one of the things about it is it's almost always in the barrel because this wine gets more time in oak than their other wines. So I'm almost always tasting all the other wines in bottle and then this wine in barrel. And every time I taste this wine, I just can't believe that it's not the ugly duckling, but it's like just kind of like not ever really talked about. and it just, every time I taste this wine in their lineup, I'm like, wow, this wine is really special. And so I thought it'd be fun to taste the wine that maybe people haven't seen or heard of, because it's not one of their sort of, Oakville wines or Tokalon wines. So this is the Mondavi Stag's Leap Cabernet. Now you're tasting a wine that's 2 years older. You can definitely taste the ripeness in this wine. That more of that candied quality, sort of liqueur kind of quality is very much in this wine. Obviously, part of it is because it's 2 years older, but also this year had that really intense heat. And I think that this wine is, whereas the first two, I'd be sort of tempted to say, hey, probably I should cellar this for a few years. This wine is starting now to show a little bit softer edges and these, those sort of softer edges and those flavors about that you get with that bottle age, that sort of leathery or tobacco-y or those sort of cedary notes, I think are really, really cool in that wine. And so this is a wine that, like you just give that a good decant for an hour or two and it's absolutely ready to drink. So that's the Robert Mondavi 15 Stag's Leap Cabernet. So I noticed that somebody raised their hand, so I want to just say, and James from my office is watching. So James, I think we have somebody who's raised their hand, and so if you want to ask a question on the screen, you're more than welcome to, but you're going to be part of the recording. Just know that. Otherwise, you can just type it in, but ask away.
Hey, Antonio.
Hey.
Thanks, first of all, for doing this. This is awesome. Quick question. In kind of thinking about the first two wines, the Chimney Rock and the Schaefer, with the vineyards right next to each other, when looking at this map, is most of the differences driven in the winery by the winemaker? Could you talk a little bit about what's driving those differences? Same vintage with the vineyards right next to one another.
I mean, I just think it's mostly a question of sort of style of wine. So I'll start with Schaefer. So I didn't really go into the full story when we were talking about the map because I didn't want to get too off-piste, which is my tendency, too off track. But so John Schaefer buys his ranch in 1973, moves his family from Chicago, and as I said, they had all of these. You can read on the map, on the back of the map, but basically the ranch was planted with golden chasselas and these other sort of indigenous grapes at the time, and he starts planting grapes for high-end wine, Cabernet grapes, and then starts making some wine for himself. And then in 1978, 1978 harvest comes along, and he can't get people to help pick the grapes, workers. So the fruit ends up on the vine a few days longer than he wanted. So then the wine comes out and it's really rich, because when you harvest late, that's what can happen. You get these really intense concentrated grapes. They've spent a few days, maybe a week extra on the vine. The sun and the air dehydrate the berries. So you get this really rich kind of unctuous style. So it was 1978. And that wine became massively successful, and that was the beginning of Hillside Select. So that sort of really rich kind of style, that was sort of the beginning of a whole way of making wine. And it was kind of an accident. I think it's pretty funny, but because a lot of things in wine are like that. And so that's the story of the Hillside Select, which is one of the most iconic wines in Napa Valley. So if you're Schaefer and then you decide that you want to have a more affordable wine or a wine that's more of an entry-level Cabernet, it's clear that stylistically it has to be similar to your flagship wine. You can't have, it's very complicated for wineries when they make wines of different styles, because then the consumer has no idea what to expect. So I think when you taste 1.5, you're tasting a wine that is kind of the little brother, the little sister of the Hillside, and therefore you should expect it to be pretty rich, pretty unctuous, not quite as, you know, opulent as Hillside, but it's very much in that leaning towards that, you know, with the chocolate and the blackberry liqueur and that kind of opulence. Whereas at Chimney Rock, the wines are much more, you know, there's a whole different concept of making wine, first of all, which is starts with the idea that most of the wines are single parcel wines. So there's different clonal selections, different block selections. And so it's harder to say that there is a Chimney Rock sort of, there's a style to the wines, but it's looser, it's more loosely knit, because what she's really trying to express in each of those wines is a particularity of a block. And therefore, in that context, in that kind of a range, the appellation wine, the Stag's Leap wine, is sort of the wine that gets you, sort of interests you in exploring the other wines. So the whole concept of it, I think, is very different. And, you know, I think it's all of those things put together. I mean, I'd love to tell you there's an easy answer, but, you know, wine is fantastically complicated. And so that's the best I can do. But I think you taste the difference. I mean, or do you agree or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, two very different wines, and the explanation was great. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody else want to ask something? Everybody's very shy. I think everybody needs to have a glass of wine. So let's see. What else can I tell you about Stag's Leap? I think that obviously it's the, you know, you can read about it on the back, but it's really, as I said, I think it's 1976. It's the beginning of I think American wines being. It was blind tasting, organized by Steve Spurrier, a British journalist. American wines next to French wines. As I said before, I don't really like the whole idea of competition. I don't like the idea of sort of something being better than something else. But that was a tasting, like, you know, with some very prestigious French wines, and American wines obviously came up at the top. It was a big story, and that was really the beginning, I think, of the people taking Napa Valley wine seriously all over the world. And so, you know, we don't have a Stag's Leap wine in this tasting. We have one, I guess, this afternoon, but it's that corridor, it's that area. And, you know, there's obviously a lot of similarities. That's really, I think, what makes this area really special, is its southern location, the cooling influences of the evening, that channel that I showed you in the valley within the valley, the alternation of temperatures. So why is that important? So, you know, maybe I should talk about that a little bit, because it's a fundamental concept for the production of high quality wines. You know, as I said, we've just published a bunch of Bordeaux reviews, and it's really no different in Bordeaux as it is from Piedmont or Napa Valley. There's a concept of a diurnal shift, which is the difference between the daytime temperatures and the nighttime temperatures. And the vine is an amazingly resistant plant that can deal with all sorts of shocks. But one of the things that really distinguishes vintages of, let's say, really high quality from just good or not so good is that is this concept of temperatures cooling at night. And when vintages are complicated, it's not always only because it was hot during the day, but it's because you don't get any respite at night. And if you've ever been to Napa Valley, especially in the harvest, it will just shock you how cold it can get, and how cold it is in the morning. That's the diurnal shift, the difference between daytime highs and the daytime highs and the nighttime cooling temperatures. And in Stag's Leap, you can get a lot of that, and that's what preserves the freshness in these wines. That's what makes this one of the things that makes this region so unique. So I hope that that's a helpful explanation of the area and its wines, and that you know, it's really unique because that kind of, those sorts of contours are not things that you see in other places. You don't see that sort of valley within the valley kind of a architecture of places in too many other parts of the world, and just the whole Stag's Leap area. Being a relatively small AVA, you don't see little pockets like that are so distinctive. So I hope that those three wines have illustrated that. We've got some incredible wines to taste in the next, in the next 7 seminars. You know, our goal is to make these as fun and as educational as possible. So after today, if there's anything that you think you liked or didn't like, or you think we could do better, just, shoot us a note. Any questions I didn't answer, ask, and we'll make sure to address them in the next one. We've got some really great wines, I think, in the 24 box set. I picked them because I really wanted things that were unique, and you'll see there's some incredible wines in this tasting, like like the Blanquier Prince of Hearts, which is basically a wine that is 100% estate. That's just the lots that don't go into their top wines, but it's just absolutely delicious. And we have Napa Nook, and we have just some great wines. There's a Foreman Cabernet. There's some really cool wines in this pack, and I hope that that you'll enjoy discovering them and enjoy discovering the places where they're from. But as always, the goal is to make these seminars really interactive, especially since we can't move around as much as we would like to. Hopefully that's ending soon. But questions, comments, send them our way. Thanks so much for watching. We'll send around the link to this so you can revisit it at your leisure. And if you use the Corvin, go back and taste these wines and see how they are. But these wines will respond beautifully to air. So if you've opened them, you taste them in another hour or two, you'll see it. That's one of the things about great wines. It's really a journey. A lot of times people want to open wines like 3 hours in advance, and that's okay too. But there's a lot to be said, especially at this level, in watching wines evolve over time, watching their evolution, watching them take shape in the glass. So thanks again for your time on this Saturday. I hope you had a good time. I'm really looking forward to seeing you guys next week. Any questions or comments, send them our way. And cheers to you. Thanks. Bye-bye.